they're co-owners, like we're going to ask them to facilitate some conversations. They co-own it. It's theirs. It's not mine. It's the leadership team's leadership development program. And I'm a facilitator of making sure it comes together, but it's not David's didactic, view of the world of how they should act.
This is L&D Unlocked, a series for L&D and HR professionals looking to unlock the future of learning and development. Presented by BizLibrary, L&D Unlocked is an ongoing series where we speak to industry experts and thought leaders about the future of work, workplace trends, and how your organization can prepare today for the challenges of tomorrow. Learn more at bizlibrary.com.
Well, welcome back to another episode of L&D Unlocked by BizLibrary. I'm your host, Chris Elliott, Chief Revenue Officer here at Biz, and awesome guest for you today, David Hanrahan, Chief People Officer at Flare. We're going to be talking in depth today about leadership development programs at companies big and small, programs mature and budding. So, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Chris.
Of course. Hey, David, for the audience, would you maybe give us a quick feel for your background and kind of what led you to where you're at today?
Yeah. I came out of school really passionate about originally sort of labor movements, labor relations, and like the industrial sort of rise of the middle of America, where management started getting accustomed to the fact that there was now unions and contracts and collective bargaining. And coincidentally, in the middle of America, in the Midwest, there was these graduate programs starting to emerge to help give management the tools around how to acclimate to a new way of working. Really around the rise of unions. And so that was originally what I thought I wanted to do out of school, was to be sort of in a union environment. Mm-hmm. And briefly, I started my career at Shell Oil in a manufacturing plant and the HR team there. I was at Shell for about 4 years, and but kind of had an itch to kind of move to a little bit faster moving, innovative, less like rules and governance based workplaces, but more the building and sort of shaping new talent practices, which led me to more tech companies, more sort of media and tech companies like Electronic Arts and Twitter and so on. And I've been doing this for about 20 plus years, and now leading a people function at a startup called Flare, small company, about 260 some odd employees, based in the U.S. And so I've seen a mixture of large public scale companies, IPO, and then the smaller startup stage.
Nice. So, David, do you think maybe we'll start on the larger side? Some of the organizations you referenced, like Shell or EA. Could you give us a sense of the state of leadership development at those organizations and kind of what you were doing at the times you were there to really build out kind of depth and breadth of leadership?
Yeah, I would say my first job out of school at Shell, I was more of a participant and an observer rather than building it from scratch. I had more of an impact really on what I would call the site, the manufacturing site I worked at, and the line managers, individuals who were moving from union jobs into salaried, what we call paraprofessional or shift team leader roles, like moving into management for the very first time. We would shape some practices largely based around what do you need to know around sort of operating within the contract, but what are also some basics of good management here for our site. However, there's a vast disparity between what I would call is like what we built for line managers versus leadership at Shell. There's a lot of what we pay for at Shell. We pay for Covey classes, so we'd pay for programs that would last a week. You're in a classroom for a week. You got these leather-bound books. I think I might still have a leather-bound manual on the Covey principles. And so that was the first sort of lens I had that like, oh, sometimes companies, they hitch their wagons, they pay for content, they pay for a third party to develop their leaders. And sometimes you build it and it's kind of contextual. But it was also my first time sort of like grappling with this idea of like, do you learn leadership by being in a classroom multiple days in a row throughout the year, or do you learn in different ways? So that was my Shell experience.
So I'm curious, David, if you recall, Did those programs start when somebody was identified as like a high potential, leadership candidate? Was it kind of post promotion? What was the sequencing of getting that person kind of equipped to step into a role?
We had kind of both. We had a track for when we had programs identify so help us identify high potential talent, and we put them into rotation type of programs, so move them around from site to site. Common at GE as well. So GE had the financial leadership program, commercial leadership program, which is a lot of it is around movement. So moving you around, actually having you do different jobs in addition to classroom based training at Crotonville. I share that because I was briefly at a GE-owned subsidiary, so I got that exposure. At Shell, though, we had programs to identify high potential and move them around, rotate them, move them to different sites, as well as we had identified a need that as a company with an older workforce, we had a lot of our best leaders would retire, and we would say, gosh, how do we instill a lot of the sort of the great leadership qualities we found in our best leaders who grew up in the company? It was a company where people would still retire. They got a pension. Pension was a thing still back in the day. And these individuals are walking out with the knowledge, like the term brain drain. These are leaders going to walk out. How do we develop them? How do we develop them programmatically? It must be expensive. Let's spend a lot of money on it. Let's have them go through these courses, taught by a third party, not taught by the leader who's leaving. So there was both the high potential, but also the sort of like the need to fill a gap from people who are going to be retiring.
It's so interesting to me. Kind of you wove in the piece about GE. Earlier, I think it was this week or last, Harvard Business Review just published an article called "What Makes a Company Great at Producing Leaders," and it studied what it called talent incubators, which are just companies that just seem to churn out leadership talent. And one of the kind of crown jewel examples was GE. And I'll get the stat a little wrong, but it's something along the lines of a couple of years ago, like 30 or 40 S&P 500 companies CEOs were GE alums, just like churning out talent. And they mentioned specifically what you did, that there were traditional elements of formal training, but kind of part of what made leadership development work at scale for them were other things like job rotations, onboarding, industry certifications, things that kind of transcend what we might think of as the tactical leadership skills into just becoming a more well-rounded player at the organization.
Yeah, there's a term, I've not used it in a while, but called skill pool management, which was at a certain scale, you have a ton of leaders or a ton of professionals in a particular function who are really great, and their boss is not responsible for their destiny of that individual at this company if they're truly strong. I think Jack Welch had a similar sentiment, which was like, this is not your talent, this is the company's talent type of thing. And so we're going to manage it from a skill pool. So there's roles called skill pool managers, people who would like look, basically they weren't the manager of the individual, but they were kind of in a talent management function. And they would sort of program manage the sort of career development for those individuals outside of what the manager was doing. The manager had a role, the leader of that function had a role. But then we're also going to create structure around, well, maybe it's time, we're going to tap them on the shoulder and tap their boss on the shoulder, time for them to do something different. They've hit their 6-month mark. We want them to do something different because they're part of the skill pool. So Shell kind of had a somewhat similar philosophy there to how the commercial leadership program and financial leadership program at GE and those things worked.
All right, so I'm going to totally throw what I wasn't expecting, but I love where the conversation's going. I got together with my cousin last night, who is works for a large U.S. based retailer, and this exact point of conversation came up where his discussion was like, who owns upskilling? Do I own that as their manager? He has a large team. He has a full-time job. Is it the talent team? Is it HR? Is it learning development? Is it all of the above? What are your thoughts on that? Because I got to hear firsthand last night, how overwhelmed I think a lot of managers are with not only their full-time jobs, but then also this kind of by extension. Am I also personally responsible for leadership development with all of my team members? And I think that skill pool concept's an interesting one.
Yeah. maybe closely related to just the idea of career development in general. And so I was on a call the other day with a company, a founder who's got a tool they're trying to build and market, really around solving what is an age-old problem of career development companies. Many, like half or something of attrition is related to career development. I'm leaving my company because I'm not developing anymore, and I'm not getting what I need from my own boss or my team. So I need to go someplace else to find what I need. And so I asked this founder, I'm like, well, what's your philosophy? Does the individual own their own career development? Or does their manager or / the company? And then her answer was, well, it's kind of both, which is tricky to pull off. So I think a frontline manager, a manager of an individual, of a team of 5 people, is really like their onus is to sort of foster high performance. Performance is a little bit different than career development. Career development is my long term. It's about what my motivations are. There might be a blend of my motivations and what the company can provide. But performance management is, I need to help you see how you're doing. I need to hold this mirror up and show you as a coach, this is going well, this is what you can improve in. And then I think occasionally I want to make sure I'm having conversations with you about your development. I want to make sure that you're getting your itch scratched around your career development. There might be a day that comes when it's like your development, it's actually, we can no longer do what you want. We can no longer provide what you want for yourself. So I think managers own creating high performing teams. Leaders of functions own high performance for their work, for their functions over the longer term, and also own like broader skill development and sort of skill gap closure for their functions. Like if my engineering team doesn't have machine learning or AI as a skill, it's not the manager. So there's one manager whose like whole job is to sort of hit the roadmap, sort of delivery goals for this week. I need to be solving for that somehow. It's going to be taking a little bit longer term. But ultimately, the individual owns their own career development. They might be completely misaligned with what we want to do. They might have nothing. They might not want anything to do with AI, and yet that's that whole leader's thing. Is like, I'm trying to solve an AI skill issue for my team over the next 2 years.
That's a great overview, David. I love the kind of the walk through the different levels and the role everybody plays. Hey, maybe to round out this part of the segment, we started kind of talking about some of the larger organizations. We'll get to maybe the scrappier, kind of budding environments. But as you think about, for our listeners who maybe they are at a larger organization, perhaps a larger budget, more mature in their journey, what are some of the kind of nice to haves as it relates to really thinking about talent development that you'd encourage them to look into if they have the resources, be it cash or human resources that we may not see as we talk about kind of some of the budding programs, but for more mature program, what are some of the things that you think really do kind of extend the experience and lead to results that are tangible when it comes to leadership development?
Yeah. I will say I'm not the biggest proponent of buying leadership courses off the shelf. Meaning, hey, there's this great program, and it's a vendor that gets really high marks, and it costs a lot of money. And look at the logos of this one works with Google and blah 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 and all these other companies. More often than not, that's a bit of a trap from my perspective. Around, okay, we're going to go work with this company because so and so works with them, and they're a preeminent, sort of competitor to us. Typically vendors have a point of view. They have an approach that they take. I used a coaching platform, so exec coaching is one. I'll give you one example of something you might invest in is exec coaching. It's hard to do exec coaching in-house. It's hard to say, hey, even at 1,000 employees or whatever you think is kind of larger scale, 1,000, 10,000 employees, hey, we're going to pair up our high potential leaders at the director to VP level with an internal coach or a mentor, someone who's already busy, who already has a job, and now you're going to be their coach. I've similarly not seen that work, yet coaching can play a very important role to leadership development. It can solve an important need. At the same time, I've had one of the worst blow up in my face situations by bringing in an exec coaching vendor that had technology, it had features. It was like, wow, look at their, the references all pan out. They have an amazing roster of coaches. This seems really fancy. totally blew up in my face because of stylistically how the coaches wanted to work, how they wanted to work with the participants, the people getting the coaching. Just didn't map to the culture, didn't map to like how we worked. Blew up in my face. So I think it's really about first starting with like, what problem are you going to try and solve for? So when it's like, hey, resources are no problem, what would you recommend, David? It starts with what problem you're trying to solve for. I think a big one is, number one, identifying more tangibly, objectively, what is the leadership gap or skill development that we're looking to solve for. Is it functional or is it behavioral? So let's just say I've got a leadership development challenge in my company. People don't talk to each other at the leadership level. There's all these silos. There's a passive aggressiveness that manifests at the leadership level that's kind of commonplace now. And yet these handful of leaders over here, they kind of go against that grain and they're great, but they're the exception. It's more often than not that I've got a bunch of leaders who kind of act the wrong way. And where's that coming from? You know what? It's coming from someone who's role modeling that at the C-suite. And what do we do there? Is there anything dollar-wise I can do to fix that? Probably not. You could maybe find a tremendous exec facilitator. So I'm going to introduce an executive facilitator for the executive team to help like get into behaviors and dynamic and building trust. We're going to use like the Patrick Lencioni dysfunctions model and really get analytical, bring in a facilitator, do some diagnostic. It depends. It depends at that level around the mapping of the solution, whether it's a person or a tool to the problem, and if that's right. And it depends. So unfortunately, my feedback is there isn't a magic silver bullet dollar solve of like, David, I'm going to tell you, hey, leadership development wise, be sure to invest in this. I think if there's an investment in anything, it's kind of data and information that helps you like visualize and make clear the problem we're trying to solve for, that you can then talk about with the key people, the CEO, the exec team generally. That's where the hard work is. It's not really something that you can just deploy from a dollars perspective.
Two things that I love about the response you gave. One is the acknowledging there is no silver bullet to not only leadership development. It's probably true of most all business problems. There's no one answer. The other thing is just so candid to share is that not every initiative is a wild success. In fact, some of them just flop. And that's not unique to you. It's unique to everybody out there. And I really appreciate you sharing that with the audience. If you don't mind, you went in a direction that I'm sure you used all the data you had at the time, seemed like the right move. The references checked. It didn't pan out in your organization. How'd you guys recover? When that one didn't work out like you thought, did the initiative get scrapped as a whole and you moved on to greener pastures, or did you pivot in the approach that you were going to take for those leaders?
Yeah, in that particular case, it was an exec coaching platform, and we said it was an analytical process to identify where are our really high potential and key leaders. So it's at this level, who are they? Use a framework to sort of like, kind of rationally and sort of in a debiased way, sort of understand it's these individuals. We want to invest in them. We want to invest in them and see them continue to grow. And this will be a benefit to them if they participate in their own sort of career development. And again, like the punchline is it didn't work. And so it called into question the solution rather than the problem. We still knew the problem was we need to invest. We need to see them take another leap. They're really good at this one thing, but we want to develop them in these other things, oftentimes behaviorally. And so let's pivot. And the pivot was actually, I use the exec facilitator as an example. In this case, we had an exec facilitator who knew the audience. So that was introduced coaches who actually don't know the people very well, and they're going to be coming in cold. This person over here knows them, came in with a different thesis, came in to work with the exec team kind of broadly. And now we're seeing that they're actually striking a relationship. They're building trust. A lot of this comes down to trust, and where do you build trust? This individual is building trust, and we can actually take a different tack in terms of exercises with them aimed at, rather than isolated, private, one-on-one coaching. The whole thing is how they're showing up in the executive team. Let's let the facilitator who actually knows the executive team is there, actually comes to the meetings, work with them, work with the CEO, work with their boss to say, hey, I think you need to take a slightly different tack. You can have this conversation, work with me so I can kind of know my role. And that was a pivot. I think there's probably been examples of times when I've tried leadership development as well. Leadership, so pulling together a program where the feedback on the content itself was not good. I'm thinking of a third party that we brought in, and I think my role, back to trust. They need to hear that the feedback is not good for me. Like they need to see that I'm hearing it, I'm internalizing it, I'm taking it, and we're going to make adjustments so that ultimately this is serving a need for them. If they're seeing this as David is foisting this thing on us, who is this random person and this company with a logo I've never seen before, and I have to go to this class for 2 hours every month, and it's pointless. I don't know what we're doing. I have to read this book from them, and it feels and like if they're distrusting it, and I don't have the trust, I don't respect, and I'm not pivoting on it, then I lose it, and then the participation goes to zero in the next cohort or whatever. Definitely. And so when that was happening, what was most important to me was that people were seeing that I was responding to it. I was taking the facilitators aside. We were making adjustments as much as possible. But then finding the off ramp at a certain time, we make an investment. This thing served its purpose. We're not going to do round 2 with that solution. Let's take the wins that we can take with this third party and then build off of it. Plenty of those examples where it's like, you look at it as not like leadership development failed at the company, but more of we tried something, it had a few wins. On balance, it didn't strike all the needs that we had, so let's do chapter 2. And I'll finish with one last thought. Where it has worked the best, in my view, in terms of a pivot or sort of like building something anew or sort of like round 2 of leadership development, is when the leaders can co-own it. So meaning we're building content, we're looking at solutions, we've done an RFP if it's a third party thing, or we're building the content together, we're coming up with the approach. If they are like leaders teaching leaders, like they're co-owners, like we're going to ask them to facilitate some conversations, they co-own it. It's theirs. It's not mine. It's the leadership team's leadership development program. And I'm a facilitator of making sure it comes together, but it's not David's didactic, view of the world of how they should act, and that really goes well.
That's what I love about this show is you never know where it's going to go. It's unscripted. And I think the conversation went into some just really impactful areas, because I see this frequently, across our client base, where someone will try an initiative and it doesn't have the success that they wanted to have. It doesn't take. And I think too often that can turn into, to your point, like we're going to shut down whatever developmental area that was, whether it's leadership or something else. And oftentimes, like, success is just this far away with the right pivot. Kind of turning your setback into a comeback. Let's do this before we get to budding programs. We take just a small break to hear from the sponsor of today's episode, BizLibrary, and then we're going to pick it right back up with budding programs.
At BizLibrary, we know that employee development and retention have never been more critical to your business. We help you build learning programs that create safe and inclusive work environments, elevate employee skills, and develop leaders who drive results. So now, you can take award-winning BizLibrary content and put it to work to help overcome your biggest challenges. BizLibrary, where learning happens.
We're back. So thanks so much. Let's talk a little bit, David, about programs that are just starting. And think of a company that maybe they have annual compliance and onboarding. They're very early in their journey. I think you've been a part of some of those organizations. What does that journey look like when you're really starting with not a lot of momentum behind you outside of just the basics of training?
Yeah, that's us now. I think we have some compliance training, and yet we have an intense itch from our. I say the word leaders, but it's really anyone with a direct report, like all managers, anyone who has a team is a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an itch, there's a desire, there's also a recognition that like you could be in a room and like we're seeing like this is not as much from a leadership team that I would expect relative to dialogue or behaviors or assertiveness or take your pick. So itch and observation, itch from them, they want to do better, observation from others that like, yeah, we need to do better. And so where do you start? There's a lot of us, maybe people listening in can recognize this trap you might fall in, which is like analysis paralysis. Like a year later, you're still talking about, wouldn't it be great if we have a leadership development program? And like, yeah, we've been talking about this every month for the past 12 months. And so where do you begin is really getting people in a room. So you gotta get a population, whether it's all leaders or a cohort, or let's start with the sales leaders, anyone who has a direct report in sales. Let's get a prime target population who would actually be game for trying something that is going to be a little bit iterative and it's going to be like half baked. And so, okay, well, what's the content, David? Like, what are we going to actually talk about? Let's build out the script. Let's build out slides. Some of the best like leadership development experience that I've seen, I'll use Twitter example. So Dick Costolo at Twitter at the time, pre-IPO, he was seeing just this kind of dysfunctional behaviors at times, but other times just wildly divergent management behaviors. And he just had in his head a lot of these like very basic principles he wanted to see from the managers around how they communicate, clarity of communication, like not avoiding tough conversations, hiring. And so he had a few different topics. He had maybe 3 pages of notes. He just had some notes and he said, I'm going to get 20 of us in a room together. The people team is going to join me. Let me sit down with the people team to sort of like workshop the ideas a little bit. Then we're getting in a room. We're just doing it. We're going to do it. And he emceed. So he didn't have slides. He just sort of like, I want to talk you through these topics and let's talk about it. Let's talk about tough conversations. Here's a model I, Dick, have. Here's an example I have from a time when I was in Chicago and something didn't work out, and what I learned from it. What do you all think? What's an example of your best manager you've ever had on this and your worst manager? What do they do? What do they do about this stuff? And like waiting lists to get into this. Part of it is because it was Dick, the CEO. It's like, okay, I want to be trained by Dick, in our management principles. But the other part of it was like, this is engaging. I'm not having to look at slides for 3 hours. We're going to like talk. We're going to get into some real stuff. I can share what I did. This is my chance to say what I actually did at my company that worked really well. And Dick might react to it and say, that's great. We should be doing that here. And so I've used that principle ever since, back to the original question of like, where do you start? What do you do when you don't have the resources? You find some topics that are like hot button topics. You get a group in a room together and see if there's anything that rises to the top. So setting direction. We really believe in this OKR format. Let me take that note. And I'll take that into the next session. And I'll say in the last session, here's what we talked about. The people role is not to tell. The people role is not to, I'm going to teach you. I'm going to walk you through these slides. The people role is to facilitate a dialogue with a varying level of groups of like, I'm really experienced VP. I'm a little bit more junior manager. I can share. I have actually great stuff. And then we build off of that. And then it becomes a consensus of like, yes, we like the way that's how we set direction here is based on OKRs or V2 MOM. And all that takes is starting and being comfortable with the discomfort of like, this is going to be an unstructured conversation. There's no slides, but we're committed. We're committed to, in these 3 hours, talking about these 3 topics, 1 an hour for 3 hours today and 3 hours tomorrow. That model's worked tremendously well. And I've used it at a few different companies.
David, it's so fun. The entire time I'm listening to you, I think we've actually been on a similar journey here at BizLibrary. We're very similar size to Flare, and a couple of years ago, as we have to drink our own champagne. We should have formalized programs to support our leaders, and some of the initial programs were our CEO and founder just sharing some of his core tenets that he found to be, kind of universal truths to leadership philosophy. and it was some of the best experiences that I've ever had when it comes to just kind of trying to up level your game. And that's where it started. It's evolved over time, but I think you have some very salient advice here on don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right.
Don't if you are starting, don't hold yourself to the GE standard, because it's totally you'll never start. You don't become the GE leadership development program overnight. It might be, to your point, 3 topics over 3 days, but that's where it can start and really become something special.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's ideal to have, like, call it a co-founder or someone who's like influential, so that it's not just me championing this. Like, we got to get in a room together and talk about communication and tough conversations and comp conversation. If you're the only one at the exec team who's waving that flag, you might not get people to show up, or they're showing up begrudgingly, or they're showing up and they're like checking their phone the whole time. So it has to be a priority, not just of the people leader. And so that's the other thing in preparation and getting this going. You might find that the co-founder actually has some very interesting or important points that they want to get across. So, like, hey, here's some notes. Here's some things I think is important. Can you take that? Or better yet, how about I come to the first one and I'll be part of it and I'll share some conversations. There's other sort of design choices in there around should someone and their boss be in the same cohort session in terms of like comfort of conversations
Right.
and such. But I've seen it work really well. I've continued to use it. We're not yet doing this at Flare. I'm actually taking a slightly different tact for 2024, or at least the first quarter that I can talk about. But I'm a believer in it.
If I can throw one final topic out there, you've seen, you've got the time and seat now to have seen the skills that are required to be a successful leader evolve, and I think particularly post-pandemic, where you have kind of this really big move to remote first. I think it's probably never been harder to be a people leader than it is right now. But what's your perspective on that, and what are some of the skills and requirements that are on managers now that maybe they didn't have to have at scale 4 years ago, 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's a good question. So thinking about the pandemic experience, I think it's like we're tempted to say that, like, now more than ever, we, like, leaders have to communicate in different ways because, like, not everyone's in the office or something like that. I actually don't think that's a new concept in terms of distributed development and having global teams and, like, always having a challenge with, like, who's calling in from different time zones and who's here with me versus traveling and all that sort of stuff. But I think from the pandemic to now, a quote I really like is the job of a leader during uncertain times is to put more truth into the world. And so what that means is during COVID, during this tech layoff era that we're in, during what's going to happen next year, uncertainty, anxiety, fear. I think a leader is increasingly challenged not on how they're communicating, so meaning am I over Zoom or what's the form of my communication, but what they're communicating, and understanding, like, sequentially, understanding context, understanding, being able to read the room, having a high EQ to understand going into this meeting right now. Here's what I think people are going to need to hear from me on, and I'm not going to sugarcoat things, but I'm also going to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. So it's not about spinning things, it's about sort of, here's what I know, here's what I don't know, and here's, like, to hone us, here's where I think we need to focus. In that, I think in what you communicate, I think leaders on EQ, it's a little bit more of the how. On EQ, what I found, some of the most skilled leaders during this time that I've been working pick their moments on when they're going to communicate, and they're consistent and predictable. I'll give you an example. One leader I know who's like really widely viewed as one of the best communicators and widely respected, typically chooses to talk last in a room. So facilitates a discussion. I want to, like, here's a question that I have. I'm going to look around. I'm going to see who has everything to say. I'm going to make sure everyone does have a chance to say something, and then they'll say they'll have the last word.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Jeff Bezos subscribes to that. He has this whole like bring a memo, like we're going to have a memo to have a conversation versus slides. But this particular leader, similarly, EQ, interestingly, and I don't know if it's trainable or not, but it's certainly important. So the Travis Bradbury research is as you ascend an organization from manager, director to VP to C-level, EQ goes down. And yet it is nonetheless true that the best performing leaders are those rare few at each level where it's incrementally is going down who actually have a high EQ. And so I think this is probably maybe closely related. There's empathy, there's intuition, there's being able to read a room, there's being able to understand how you show up in a moment, how you're viewed by others, how you use emotion, or how you sort of use the sort of the fraught nature of the moment to actually settle and focus people, versus not having that ability, has particularly right now in the era that we're currently in, huge impacts on teams. The teams of those leaders being able to find their way out, and find growth and find success.
David, I would keep going, but we're out of time. Let me, if I can ask you in 60 seconds or less, what are some of just the key takeaways you think for the audience? I'll kick us off with two. I loved you got to start somewhere, so start. And I really loved kind of the examples you shared on pivoting, that it's only failure if you let it be a failure. Otherwise you're learning, and turn that setback into a comeback. Just keep, turning the Rubik's Cube till you can get all the colors to come out. But what about you? What are some of the key takeaways you think for the audience?
Another one where I think it resonates for us right now is write down what you believe. So as it relates to, I want to get us in a room together to talk about management principles. I'm just worried. I have no idea where all these people are coming from. Let's start with something to react to on what we believe. And it might be you and your co-founder, or you and another leader. And like, we're going to go back and forth on a document, and then we're going to share it a little bit widely. And so writing it down on what you believe and allowing it to be a starting point for us to get in a room is a surprisingly easy hack. And yet a lot of people don't do it, bother writing down what they believe on their leadership principles, or they conflate our values with our leadership principles, which are oftentimes different. So write it down.
David Hanrahan, Chief People Officer at Flare, thank you so much for coming on L&D Unlocked. To the audience, so appreciate you listening and tuning in. You can find all of the episodes on our website, bizlibrary.com, right under the resources button. You also find us on YouTube. And if you're not, make sure to connect with David and myself on LinkedIn. I always post as these episodes are dropping. So classically, make sure you smash the little bell and you'll always get notified when those come out. David, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
All right. Take care.
This episode has been brought to you by BizLibrary. Head to bizlibrary.com for more information.